What's up YouTube? In this video I want to give you my opinion about using the Fuji X-T4 as a main video hybrid camera. As you might know, I'm a Sony shooter for the last 3 years now. As the Fuji got announced, it definitely catch my attention because it has a stabilized sensor, it offers up to 4K 60p with 10-bit internal recording, and it has a good autofocus system with face and eye detection for video. I wanted to see how this performs in comparison to my Sony A7 III, so let's get right into it. Talking about the handling of the Fuji X-T4, I never used a Fuji before, so it was completely new to me, and coming from a Sony, you definitely need to get used to the controls of a Fuji. Not saying anything bad, but in the beginning you will struggle a bit because of all the manual dials and buttons. I would say it is a little bit more complex than a Sony camera, so for beginners the Sony might be easier to handle. Let's talk about the fully articulated touchscreen. In some situations it was definitely very useful, and in some situations maybe not. Since I'm not a vlogger, I don't really care about it too much. I was always happy with the Sony monitor system, and the previous Fuji cameras also had a similar system. Besides the positive aspects that it was very easy to film low to the ground and none of the gimbal arms were blocking the screen anymore. But to use the camera correctly on a gimbal, you always need to flip out the monitor in order to balance it correctly. That is not only a little bit annoying, but it is also somehow causing a strange weight distribution on the gimbal, so the horizon level on my gimbal was a little bit off, but this could be easily compensated inside the Cyan app under the motor calibrations. But I didn't recognize it during the shoot, so I actually had to fix it in post. Let's talk about the autofocus. The continuous autofocus works surprisingly good. Sometimes the AF lost the focus on the model, for example in this backlight situations, but in the majority of shots the focus stayed on her face. I would say it is still not on the level of a Sony's autofocus performance, but it is at 80 to 85% of that. Hopefully Fuji will improve the AF performance in future firmware updates. And also keep in mind, not every Fuji lens will give you the exact same AF performance. From what I heard, the f2 primes will have a better AF performance in video than the f1.4 prime lenses. So all I can say is that the kit lens as well as the 35mm f2 seem to be a good choice for video autofocus work. Colors and dynamic range. I shot the whole video with the standard Eterna profile, and all I can say is that the colors are looking pretty good right out of the camera. I still graded it with one of my LUTs at 65% of intensity, but it worked quite well. I didn't test the f-log profile because I don't want to deal with a base ISO of 640. I had the camera only for a couple of days, so I could not play around with all the other picture profiles that this camera offers. If you are familiar with Sony, you know that the HHG profile will provide an awesome dynamic range while at the same time keep your base ISO at 125. But until I decide to switch to Fuji, I need to make more tests about the color profiles and how good they are to color grade. But if you want to use the camera without much grading, just use the Eterna profile. Yeah, of course, if you compare it to my Sony videos, maybe the colors seem a little bit different, and that is just because I'm not yet that experienced on color grading and using the Fuji system, so I need to get used to that. And the Fuji also offers a HLG profile, but it has a base ISO of 1000. Yeah, but that's how it is, and either you have to deal with it or you use f-log when you want to do heavy grading. But you can clearly see on the footage that it is not that easy to maintain the highlights on the Eterna profile as it is with the Sony HLG profile. So I guess you have to work with f-log if you want to have the widest dynamic range. Let's talk about the IBIS. I did not do a scientific test about the sensor stabilization, but it helps to smooth out all the small micro jitters that any gimbal are producing, so I would always leave that on. The Fuji X-T4 also offers a stabilization boost where the camera crops in a little bit and starts to add a software-based stabilization on top of that. But what I experienced, unless you don't hold the camera steady in your hands while doing handheld movements, the stabilization starts to make some weird robotic-like movements, and I have to say that I won't use that function a lot because I still want to have a little bit more of an organic feel to my handheld footage. So what's my conclusion? Will I switch from Sony to Fuji? The Fuji offers basically everything I ever wished for. That is having a hybrid camera with 4K up to 60p with reliable autofocus in video, and having a light setup that can easily be operated on a one-handed pistol grip gimbal. So for 99% of the work I do, 4K is totally enough, and if a video ends up being posted on social media, why should I bother handling massive 6K or even 8K video files? If you look at the announced Canon EOS R5 or the Panasonic S1H. Even with the Fuji material, my computer had to struggle with 4K 60p 10-bit at 200 megabytes per second on the heavy compressed H.256 codec, so I actually had to work with proxy files inside Premiere Pro. So will I switch from Sony to Fuji? And the answer is not yet. I invested a lot in Sony glass, and the Sony autofocus system on the A7 III or even the better AF system on the A7R4 are still ahead of the Fuji autofocus system. When it comes to the colors and the final look of the image, I still prefer the full frame look of the Sony, and even so with only 8-bit internal or external recording. And we are still waiting for the announcement of the A7S II successor, and until I don't know what Sony will come up with in this year, I still prefer to wait a little bit longer. But when the next A7 model comes out and they don't improve anything video related, I will consider the switch again.